Today much of the news that reaches us from the Arab world is about Syria, yet another seemingly interminable conflict in that faraway region that has embroiled U.S. forces and presented American policymakers with the incessant no-win either way question of do we stay or do we go? Well, 7 years ago, the news from over there was dominated by Libya. The downfall and death of Muammar Qadhafi in 2011 was giving rise at that time to great euphoria and high hopes of a new Libyan order and much better days for Libyans. Instead, the ensuing years have seen a descent into civil war, the arrival of Islamic State fighters, and an overwhelming migration crisis. Attacks on 2 U.S. government facilities in Benghazi in 2012, which resulted in the deaths of 4 Americans, including Ambassador Christopher Stevens, have forever stained our impressions of Libya. In his new book, The Burning Shores, Frederic Wehrey examines what went wrong following Qaddafi's demise, dismissing the notion that the current chaos was inevitable. After the end of so many years of strongman rule, he explores the turning points and missteps that account for the tragedy that Libya has become. And at one point in the book, he quotes President Obama in one of his exit interviews, calling the failure to plan for what followed Qaddafi the worst mistake of Obama's presidency. What's the relevance of any of this today? Well, as Fred notes in his prologue, there are lessons in the Libyan story that can be applied to the larger drama unfolding in the Arab world, whether it's Syria, Iraq, or elsewhere. An Arabic-speaking scholar, Fred brings considerable knowledge and experience to this timely assessment of Libya. At the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, where he's a senior fellow in the Middle East program, Fred has focused on Libya as well as other parts of the Arab world. He's traveled across the Middle East a number of times, and his previous book 5 years ago, Sectarian Politics in the Gulf, examined the Shia-Sunni divide that has been exacerbated since the 2003 invasion of Iraq. The Burning Shores is an engrossing narrative history that draws on Fred's extensive reporting, including interviews with activists, revolutionaries turned militia bosses, and jihadi recruits, as well as profiles of ordinary Libyans whose lives have been overturned. The book is as authoritative and balanced an account of Libya's recent turmoil as you're likely to find. So, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Fred Wehrey.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much for coming tonight and to listen about Libya, especially given all the other crises in the world today, Syria, Russia, North Korea, not least the crisis here in the United States. I think it's important to remember that the United States and Libya have a long history together, going back to the founding of the American Republic, when the first overseas military operation by the United States for regime change was in actually the country that is now Libya, when United States Marines landed in eastern Libya to unseat the ruler of Libya, who was threatening American shipping at the time in 1805, the so-called Barbary Wars. We know this in the Marine Corps hymn, The Shores of Tripoli. Fast forward to the 1950s, under the Libyan monarchy, the largest American military base in the world was in Libya. It was an Air Force base where American bombers trained for runs against the Soviet Union. All that changed in 1969 when a young Libyan army officer named Muammar Qadhafi overthrew the monarchy. And what followed is really how we associate Libya, this cartoonish dictator, this larger-than-life figure. It's important to remember that when he first came to power, he did implement a lot of reforms. Libya, before he came, the illiteracy rate was 90%. He implemented medical care. He modernized the country. But then very quickly, his rule degenerated into kleptocracy, a brutal dictator who implemented this wacky form of socialism. He forbade any private wealth. He collectivized the economy, which ruined it. And then, of course, he exported terrorism. And this led him into confrontation with the United States. Ronald Reagan famously called him the mad dog of the Middle East. He was really public enemy number one before Osama bin Laden. He was responsible for the largest mass murder of Americans before 9/11. That's the Lockerbie bombing. Then he came out of the cold. He reformed himself. This started in the 1990s. He cleaned up his act. The first President Bush likes to say that the invasion of Iraq in 2003 was responsible for Qadhafi coming in from the cold and relinquishing his weapons of mass destruction. That's not really true. It started under the Clinton administration. But regardless, Qadhafi renounced terrorism. He renounced his weapons of mass destruction. He became a partner for the United States. The U.S. Embassy returned to Libya in the mid-2000s, and that's where I first became involved in Libya. I returned there as a U.S. military officer working at the U.S. Embassy. It was a surreal experience. The word Orwellian is often overused, but this truly was an Orwellian state where you would walk around the capital and see Qadhafi's picture everywhere. You would see his slogans. He fashioned himself this sort of philosopher king. It was a brutal place. It was a police state. We were always followed by secret police everywhere. Nobody spoke their mind. It was also a place of enchantment, a place of great beauty and history. You have these Roman ruins by the sea with these stunning views of the sea. You have old Italian architecture, desert oases. So a place of enormous potential. Fast forward to 2011, the Arab Spring is erupting in Tunis, in Cairo. I was at the U.S. Embassy in Tripoli. Nobody believed that the protests would come to Libya. We believed that Qadhafi had enough oil wealth to buy off dissent, but more importantly, we didn't understand this country. We did not have access to parts of the country, to the key players, especially in the eastern part. And the eastern part of Libya was where it started, in the city of Benghazi. Benghazi is a rich Mediterranean city with a rich history going back to the Greek times. It was neglected, and this is where the first protest started at a courthouse on February 17th, 2011. We all know the story of what happened with the intervention by President Obama. In my book, I interview many of his senior officials. People genuinely believed that Qadhafi was going to make good on his threat to quash the uprising with great force. It did not turn out to be the genocide that many people realized. There was a lot of misinformation about what was happening. But you have to go back to that moment in 2011, enormous revolutionary fervor in the Arab world, Tunis, Cairo. The belief was that if Qadhafi was allowed to crush his own people, it would send a signal to other Arab dictators that it was okay to do that. And plus you had this enormous alignment of forces in the world. Qadhafi had no friends coming to his aid. The Arabs wanted him out. The United Nations, the NATO, everything was aligning. And especially the French and the Europeans were pushing for intervention. Obama made this 11th hour decision to intervene. And that story is well known. I think the really interesting story, and this is where I pick up, is what came next. What happened after Qadhafi fell, after he was killed at the hands of rebels in October 2011. The United States intervened in Libya with the explicit desire to not be responsible for the follow-up, to not do nation building in Libya the way it had done in Iraq. And I was a military officer in Iraq, and I saw the occupation firsthand. That was weighing on Obama's mind heavily. So he intervened, and then he handed it off to the Europeans and the United Nations. Now, the story of what happens after is the focus of my book. It's based on travels across the country throughout the years, interviews with Libyans, with militia leaders, but also with Western officials who were involved. The great tragedy of this is that there was really no follow-up. We should have seen this coming. Qadhafi really ruined this country. He ruled it through one-man rule. He personalized his rule. He didn't leave Libyans with any institutions to govern. So they were starting from scratch. The United Nations had a presence. They were trying to move the country toward elections. The Europeans were trying to do this. But the Libyans were really incapable of governing themselves. Needless to say, when you arrived in Tripoli in those early months after Qadhafi fell, you felt this enormous hope. You felt this sense of euphoria, walking around the streets, talking to Libyans. For the first time, they're living politics. They're able to speak freely. They're organizing themselves. You see it in the squares, protests. They're forming charities. They have free press. So there was this enormous moment of triumph. The goal during that first year was to move the country toward elections, parliamentary elections. And elections were held in July 2012. Now, that's an incredibly quick time to move from a dictatorship, Qadhafi fell in October 2011, to a democracy. And those elections went off well, but then the question is, what next? Elections by themselves don't make a democracy. Libyans had no culture for political participation, no culture of consensus. And so very quickly after those elections, the country unraveled, the country fell apart. Needless to say, I mean, when you were there, you had an American diplomatic presence, a very small presence led by the ambassador, Chris Stevens, who was beloved by Libyans for his outreach to the Libyan people. And there was this sense of trying to help the Libyans in areas like education and media. What was ignored was the militias. You had the growth of these armed groups. Qadhafi didn't have an army. He didn't leave an army or a police behind. So there were militias running around on the streets. Many of them were tied to towns, to tribes. And the failure to deal with those militias, I think, was a major mistake that led to the country's unraveling. Some of those militias were radical Islamists with ties to Al-Qaeda, and that leads us to the tragic attack of September 11th and 12th in 2012, which really dominates the American imagination, where we lost 4 brave Americans. My book tries to reconstruct that attack through court records that are now available, through interviews with Libyans who were there that night. It tries to tell the story of what happened in a hopefully nonpartisan way. But more importantly is the aftermath. What did this attack do to Libyans, to Libya itself? We know what it did here in Washington, D.C., this horrendous partisan witch hunt, years of congressional investigations that spent millions of dollars of taxpayer money. Benghazi became this radioactive word. Libya itself became radioactive. But what about in the city of Benghazi? The Westerners pulled out of that city. Libyans felt abandoned. Every Libyan I spoke to in the city of Benghazi had enormous sadness and regret for what happened to Chris Stevens and those 3 other Americans. And there were protests in the street against the attack, memorializing these fallen Americans. What happened in the capital was the American diplomatic presence shrunk. The Americans hunkered down behind the embassy walls. The mission of the U.S. Embassy at that time became really to avoid another loss of life and to get the culprits of the attack. So you had, ironically, this constriction of American diplomacy, which was the exact opposite of what Chris Stevens was about. He was about meeting ordinary Libyans, going out on the streets, and tragically all that constricted. The American presence shrunk. And that happened at just the point when Libya was falling apart, when the Libyan revolution was starting to turn on itself. The country was sliding toward civil war, especially in the city of Benghazi, the birthplace of the revolution. There were killings of activists. One of the tragedies of Libya is that the original activists in the revolution, these moderate human rights activists, people who had a moderate vision for the country, were killed, were murdered, were exiled. People that could have formed bridges between different Libyan factions were pushed aside. And I profile one of them in my book, a human rights activist named Selwa Bogegis, a very articulate woman who was murdered in her home in Benghazi in 2014. There were 20 gunshots in her body, and it was just a huge seismic event in Libya that this woman, this symbol of inclusion, was gunned down in her own home. The country broke into civil war in the summer of 2014. It started in Benghazi, where the revolution began. It was a complex civil war launched by a man named Khalifa Haftar, a general who claimed to be fighting Islamists in Benghazi. It quickly spread across the country, engulfing the entire country. It was about control for the country's oil wealth, about control for power. And the great tragedy in all of this is that the U.S. Was in retreat. The U.S. had evacuated its embassy. Arab powers, Qatar, Egypt, United Arab Emirates, started sending weapons and money to the different factions, which really poured gasoline on the fire. So this power vacuum emerged. Westerners completely pulled out. I remember traveling to the country at that time during this state of civil war, and you had to negotiate this patchwork of militias. The different militias controlled different towns. There were checkpoints. It was a very dicey situation. I had to trust my driver, who had to get the right password to go through these militia checkpoints. It was a place of despair. The standard of living went down. Basic services were demolished. People were fleeing the country. And unsurprisingly, when there was this vacuum created by the civil war, a jihadist group filled the vacuum. The Islamic State moved in 2014 and set up its strongest base outside of Syria and Iraq. And I went to a number of places where the Islamic State had a presence. I interviewed people who had to live under the Islamic State's rule. I also interviewed some Libyans who joined the Islamic State. Why were these young Libyans sucked up into this horrific movement? Libyans by themselves, with American support, eventually pushed the Islamic State out of their country, which is a success story in terms of counterterrorism. The United States played a supporting role. The other great tragedy of Libya is the migrant crisis. The huge flows of mostly African migrants seeking new opportunities, seeking jobs in Europe, who are making this perilous trek across Africa, from Nigeria, from West Africa, from the Sudan, through the Libyan desert, where they're at the mercy of smugglers who carry them from checkpoint to checkpoint, who keep them in safe houses where they're crowded, 20 to a room, they're beaten, they're robbed, they're raped. When they finally get to the shores of the Mediterranean, they make this perilous passage across the sea in these flimsy craft where many sink. And I've interviewed many of these migrants in detention centers in Libya where they are kept in slave-like conditions. It's one of the great, I think, moral tragedies of our time. The Europeans are trying to stop that flow of migrants. And the way they're doing it is, I think, very controversial, by trying to keep them in Libya where they're suffering horrific abuses. So again, the country collapsed. It's a failed state. Libyans, you go to Tripoli today, there's a lack of basic services, there's a lack of medical care. People in some cases don't even have access to water. They're fleeing the country. I think the story of Libya, which I try to tell in my book, needs to be told. There's this sense that Libya's history ended in 2011. It dropped off the map. There's also this sense, I think, of perhaps too much responsibility on the intervention itself, on Obama, on NATO, that the NATO intervention broke the country. That didn't happen. The NATO intervention was actually quite precise. Qadhafi broke the country through his 42 years of rule, and we're living with the consequences of that. Libyans are living with the consequences of that. Could the United States have done more? I identify in my book a number of turning points, of missed opportunities after Qadhafi fell, where I think we could have done more. I think Obama overlearned some of the lessons from Iraq. This idea, okay, you're not going to go full in with an occupation, but then going too far in the other extreme where we had no presence on the ground, no boots on the ground. We totally abdicated responsibility for the follow-up, for what came after, to these other players, to the United Nations, to the Europeans. That was, I think, going too far in the other direction. The great tragedy of all this, I think, that we're seeing in Libya and across the Arab world is this resurgence of the old authoritarianism. We see it in Egypt with President Sisi. This notion that the Arab Spring was a fleeting moment, that moment failed. It brought chaos. The protests didn't work. Democracy was tried. And so you have the return of these strongmen who are saying, look, this is what these societies need. They're so fractured. They need a strong rule. They need an authoritarian system. You have that today in the figure of this general, Khalifa Haftar, who said Libya is not ready for democracy, who promised an end to the chaos, but he wanted to rule the country through a military-style rule, which in some cases Libyans supported. The great tragedy in some of this is there is a nostalgia in Libya for Qadhafi. And I remember it. I mean, under Qadhafi, you could walk the streets of the capital at midnight. It was safe. It was a very safe place. It was a place of peace. But what kind of peace was it? It was a peace of the graveyard. There were tensions boiling beneath the surface in Qadhafi's Libya. And these types of systems where strong men rule are inherently unstable. They're going to collapse at some point. And when they do, they leave nothing but ruin in their wake. There's no transition. And I think this is the great tragedy in Libya, is that Libyans are presented with this false choice. It's either a return to the old strongman rule, or it's complete chaos, it's complete disintegration. So some Libyans are disenchanted with democracy. They had voting, they had elections, and look what it got them. And I think that's the real tragedy. The other great tragedy, I think, is the city of Benghazi. And I hope Americans can go to this city. It's a city of rich culture, rich history. It's of course been dominated in the news media by movies like 13 Hours, but it has an old waterfront of Italian architecture. It has a heritage going back to the Greeks. It was always in Libyan history a place of innovation, of activism against the Italian rule. It was where the Libyans launched their revolution. And then the country in 2014, or the city in 2014, endured 3 years of nonstop civil war, of nonstop combat during the civil war. This was during General Khalifa Haftar's operation. It completely demolished the old city. It displaced thousands of families. It tore apart the social fabric of the country, of the city. And what was really, I think, poignant to me when I was speaking to Libyans is that many of the same Libyans who gathered at the courthouse on February 17th, who were united against Qadhafi, 3 years later they were fighting each other. And I think this is a great poignant story of how revolutions go awry, how they degenerate into civil war. The basic fact of the matter is Libya is not that divided of a society. It's only 6 million people. There are not deep ethnic or sectarian tensions like in Iraq or Syria. There are some ethnic minorities. But the question I ask in my book is how did these revolutionaries turn against each other? What caused the splintering of the revolution of the country? What caused the disintegration of Benghazi? These activists who were at the courthouse, why did they start fighting each other? And I'd like to conclude with a short passage that sort of paints the scene of the civil war in Benghazi in 2015. This is after the civil war started. It's It's 3 years after, or 4 years after 2011, when you had those first protests in Benghazi. You had that euphoric moment of unity in Libya. And you have this, I'm driving through Benghazi, and you have this scene of warfare. The city's demolished. The landscape is completely transformed. Benghazi has endured destruction that is far worse than it endured in the Second World War when the Allies bombed it. So this is the scene of going through the city of Benghazi. I came in through a northern suburb called Qadhafi, the only route open. Filled with date palms and murmuring springs, Qadhafi was said to be the source for the mythical Garden of Hesperides in Greek mythology. Now it was barnacled with urban growth, breeze-block homes, mosques, and a prison where torture was rampant. At the edge of a lake, the serpentine chutes of a disused water park stood coated in grime, while black smoke rose from the shelling. I passed a bleached-out election poster for Ali al-Tarhouni, a liberal American-trained economist, his grinning face at once otherworldly and quaint in the stricken landscape. To the south, the war had all but obliterated the old city. The colonnaded fish market, where families once gathered on Ramadan nights, among the date vendors and children's games, was now a shambles of concrete. Artillery had scarred the Italianate facade of Tree Square, once beloved for its cedar, and destroyed the covered bazaar of Souk el-Jared, once filled with tailors, jewelers, and leathersmiths. In other parts of the city, the war was never far. At the end of this or that street, behind a darkened berm or a tank, lay the front and the sound of the heavy guns. I went to a field hospital where nurses tried to revive a wounded soldier. 2 holes in his stomach spurted rivulets of blood. The snipers are the worst, the man's commander told me. They wheeled him into surgery. Displaced families crowded into schools turned shelters, their classrooms doubling as bedrooms and kitchens, separated by diaphanous sheets hanging from clotheslines. In one of them, I met an old woman and her granddaughter who'd lived by the sea in Benghazi all their lives before fleeing as the clashes had started. The girl, 8 years old, got up to make coffee for us. Her father had died a year before, she said matter-of-factly, when someone drove by his shop and sprayed it with gunfire. We never knew that these sorts of people were among us, her grandmother said. I think this captures Libya's great tragedy. Thank you for your attention. I'm happy to answer questions.
I understand Libya has oil, and it's a very high-quality oil. So is the oil being sold overseas? And if so, where's that money going?
This is the big, another great tragedy is oil has rebounded. They are selling it. It's over 1 million barrels per day. The problem, though, the money's going to the central bank and it's being dispersed to militias. I mean, there's a culture of plunder. So different armed factions are basically siphoning all that oil money. It's getting distributed to the militias themselves. It's not reaching the people. It's not reaching basic services. So when I talk to the United Nations today, that's what they're really focused on, is reforming the distribution of oil.
I've read that Libya is quite tribal, and the tribes are quite strong. Do you see the possibility of the country will break into various factions, and you'll never get a unified Libya back again?
It is tribal. You know, unfortunately, those identities have really coalesced in the 7 years since the revolution. There is a shared sense of nationhood that they're still part of the Libyan nation. So I don't think it's going to physically separate into East or West. It's often not necessarily tribes, but it's towns. It's towns that are acting like city-states. They have their own army, their militia, they have their own economy. When you go between one town and another, it's like crossing into a different country. You need the permission to go into this town. So that's the fragmentation, I think, and it's hyper-localism. It's a collection of city-states. A diplomat once told me, think Renaissance Italy. I mean, where everything is being pushed down to the local level. Now, can those collection of towns still exist as a country? Perhaps, but I think we're in a different phase where, Qadhafi ruled the country through the capital. Everything was centralized. You had to go to the capital to do everything. And now everything is going down to these towns.
So I think Rand said it'd only take about 13,000 troops to have stabilized the country at the beginning.
Yeah.
That's pretty low compared to Iraq, Afghanistan. How do you convince the government and the populace that it's actually worth it?
Right. That figure I think was scaled, because Libya has a small population. The question, and I addressed this in the book, the question about having a foreign troop presence in Libya was debated. And the problem was the Libyans did not want that. They were so fearful of having any foreign troops on the ground that they rejected that. They were fearful of an Iraq-style occupation. And so they ignored that in some conflict zones in Bosnia or East Timor, peacekeepers, a stabilization force did in fact do good, by protecting key sites like the ministries or the economy. There's a lot of other problems with having a force on the ground. Do you have enough firepower to deter attacks? What happens if there is an attack? Which countries are going to sign up to contribute the troops? So and I interviewed many policymakers about that decision. And, principally it was because the U.S. didn't want it, but also, the Libyans did not want foreign troops on their ground. So, yeah. Yes, please.
In the aftermath of the Arab Spring, the shadow of failed states has been so worrisome in lots of places. And I think perhaps nowhere more problematic than in Syria. Bashar was such a despot and has held the threat of failed states and all kinds of wrong evolutions in the aftermath of overthrowing a dictator. And that's created the chaos which is Syria, I believe. Your description of Benghazi reminds me so much of Aleppo.
Yeah.
Aleppo was such a beautiful, wonderful old city 40 years ago, 50 years ago, and it had all of the culture that Benghazi did. And to now look at it, it's completely destroyed. Yeah. It's really tragic. I'd love to hear you comment on the similarities and differences between what happened in Libya and what's happened in Syria.
Well, there was a brutal dictator who was allowed to crush, what started as a peaceful uprising. And I think in Syria it was made far worse by the internationalization, where you had Iran and Russia playing this game, and the Arab states on one side, and just the scale of the displacement and the death, far exceeds Libya. But I think there are real, similarities in the way these dictators use that argument that we're the dam that's holding back the jihadists, or we're holding back these divided societies. The fact of the matter is, Assad is not a secular ruler. He's very sectarian. He played the society off against one another. He manipulated those tensions, and we're living with the aftermath today, and especially in places like Aleppo, which you mentioned, which I never got to visit, unfortunately.
Hi, thank you. I'm just wondering if you'd be willing to expand a little bit your look at what's happened in Libya to elsewhere in North Africa, in particular, sort of as a 2 points of comparison, Morocco and Tunisia, both often looked at as kind of more stable and countries where conditions are better and much more hopeful, I guess, at the present time
Yeah.
Libya or even, I guess, Algeria.
Yeah, yeah.
So is there a lesson to be learned either way, either in how to make Libya better, or how the Moroccans and the Tunisians should think about things in order to avoid the problems?
Well, certainly the Tunisians are looking at Libya, and they're just trying to block, what's happening in Libya from bleeding over in Tunisia. They built this huge border wall to prevent smugglers and jihadists, so they're just containing it. I always remember crossing the Libyan border into Tunisia and just feeling this sigh of relief. Even when I saw these custom guards on the other side who were quite surly and corrupt, but at least it was a sign of order. You at least had these custom guards. Tunisia is sort of the last hope. This is a country that got rid of its dictator, relatively peacefully, that had this social contract between Islamists and non-Islamists, that reached this arrangement with this constitution. So it was seen as a success story. The great, sort of tragedy is it is unraveling. You have massive corruption still in Tunisia. The old ways are seeping back in terms of the way the Ministry of Interior, the police forces are behaving. Tunisians I speak to are frustrated with the economy, especially in a lot of the rural areas outside the capital. So you have this sort of impulse for jihadism. So, Tunisia is still, I think, it's not out of the woods yet. It's still a country that is the object of massive American and European focus to try to help it succeed. The comparison with Libya is different. The Tunisians had this French legacy. They had a completely different history than Libya. They had institutions set up like trade unions. So they were starting at a much higher level than Libya in terms of, what could they progress to. So I don't think there's, Libyans like to say, well, we would like to borrow the Tunisian constitution. This is a model for us, but it's just so different. And same thing with Morocco. Morocco is a monarchy. The king enjoys legitimacy. There are some problems in Morocco with protests in some of the mountain areas, and there is some jihadism, but it's just a completely different style of rule. So, yeah. Well, some people in Libya are calling for a return to the monarchy. There is that movement, this nostalgia for the rule of King Idris, who ruled Libya, independent Libya before Qadhafi, who did enjoy some legitimacy, but I do talk about that in the book, about his some of the problems. Yeah.
Fred,
Sorry.
talk a little bit about the prospect of growing Russian influence in Libya. You mentioned that towards the end of the book, and do you see the prospect of Russia getting involved in Libya to the degree that they're now involved in Syria?
There again, history matters. The Russians, throughout the rule of Assad in the 60s, they had such a massive presence in Syria. They had officers, they trained, they had an entire presence there. So that history, they don't have it with Libya. They did have some presence under Qadhafi, so they don't have that foundation to build on. Now they are trying to move in. They have provided weapons and other support to the Eastern faction. They printed money for the Eastern faction. They've done some very public displays of hosting Khalifa Haftar in an aircraft carrier. They've offered medical care. So they're moving in. They sense a vacuum. The Russians feel burned. They felt burned by the 2011 NATO intervention because they did not vote against it, and so they're kind of using that look, NATO screwed this country up. We're going to come in and fix it. So there's that narrative. I think the Russian motives are twofold. They see an opportunity to poke the United States and the Europeans in the eye and undercut our influence, and they're motivated financially. Under Qadhafi, the Russians had a lot of arms contracts that they lost when he was toppled, a lot of infrastructure contracts, gas, so those are, I think, weighing heavily in their involvement.
If I could follow up, yeah. I think the audience might also be interested in hearing how you managed to get around in Libya. We were talking before the event about how the U.S. State Department has all these warnings against Americans going to Libya, yet you went like a dozen times or something in recent years. I mean, how did you manage that?
Very carefully. So you know, I have some trusted Libyan friends, fixers that I owe so much to. I owe my life to, that are mentioned in the book, that I started working with after the revolution. And so, you know, you at certain times you were unable to fly into an airport, so you had to drive across the border. In some cases, the airport was controlled by a militia, so you had to make sure that you knew that militia and you negotiated access. So everything was incremental. I mean, as I mentioned, to move from one town to the next meant, you know, my Libyan friend had to know somebody in that town, had to make sure that he had the right password to get in through that area to make sure we weren't arrested. So it was all very, you know, it's like threading your way through these different patchwork of control. Yeah, so you know, I mean, in some cases, it was quite scary. I remember in Tripoli, at the height of the civil war, when there was an Islamic State presence, you know, you had to be very, very careful. In other cases, in the east, there were the secret police. The old intelligence was back, you know, monitoring you. It was the old Qadhafi style way. They asked me to leave sometimes, so it was one or the other. So.
Did you wear disguises? Did you say you were Canadian? I mean, no. Yeah.
So reportedly Haftar had a stroke.
Yes.
About the last week.
Yeah.
So depending on the report, he's either dead, in a coma, or recovering.
Yeah.
If he were removed, would that just create more chaos, or would that actually give the power center?
Yeah, that's the question of the day in Libya, or in Washington now, that everybody's asking, and we're all, it's sort of a parlor game where we're trying to figure out where he is, and there's different reports. I mean, I think it's important to remember that when he launched his operation in Benghazi, he was really leading a coalition, a very loose coalition of militias, of military units, of tribes. They were held together by this common goal of fighting Islamists in Benghazi. When that ended, that coalition started to fracture and unravel, as things do in Libya. And a lot of people that supported him were accusing him of having these grand political ambitions, of corruption, that he was empowering his sons, just like Qadhafi did. So even before his health problems, there was a diminution of his influence. Now, what's going to happen when he goes? There's no successor. So you're starting to see a maneuvering for power in the East among different factions, among different officers. There was some violence. I think the key question is, what are the regional states that back him, Egypt and the United Arab Emirates? What are they going to do? Are they going to appoint someone to replace him? How are they going to manage that? The French are also involved. They have a relationship with Haftar. I mean, he's in a French hospital now. So we're all waiting to see, and it's a really new chapter for Libya.
Sorry, I'm just passing through from Switzerland by sheer accident. And you alluded to the Europeans, and in that sense, perhaps two questions. One, what would your advice be to European governments or the EU in terms of rebuilding Libya, institution building? And the second one, perhaps more longer term, there's a growing migration pressure from Africa that will build up for coming decades. What would your advice be there?
Right. Well, the Europeans are facing the same challenges that the United Nations and the U.S. faces in terms of building, institutions. I mean, I think the first challenge is ending the political divide. I mean, reconciling these two factions, supporting a diplomatic solution to unify, the Libyan government, to get a new government in power that enjoys, consensus. And then the question of what kind of aid they should give. I mean, look, there's already multiple programs through the European Union for training the police, for helping civil society, but you're really starting from scratch. I think a key area to help Libya is at the town level, at the local level of municipalities, because you have elected mayors, elected city councils that are actually running things okay. And so, that's where democracy starts, at the grassroots level. And so in many of these towns are actually they're making peace with their rivals. They're functioning, and so I mean that's when I did my congressional testimony yesterday. That's what I really focused on. So I think the Europeans can play a huge role there. The migrant challenge is a huge, moral challenge. The Italians have addressed it in such a way where they're subcontracting the containment of migrants to militias that are attached to the government. In some cases, they're trying to persuade these militias to stop smuggling, to become actually groups that fight the smuggling. It's a very, controversial policy. The solution of keeping these migrants in Libya in such a context where there are these detention centers, I think, is immoral. The solution is some reformulation of the entry program. I mean, that some of these migrants need to get into Europe. The other solution is to develop the Libyan economy. Libyans are involved in smuggling because it's lucrative, because it's so lucrative. I mean, we're millions of dollars, and they're doing it all across the country, starting at the southern border, the border with Africa. Those border communities don't have any economy, so young men are taking African migrants and moving them south. So develop the economy at the local level.
Hi, thank you so much for coming to speak at our store. It's been an incredibly interesting talk. I'm just wondering, I could be totally wrong, but I remember reading that only a year before the NATO intervention, that the UN Human Rights Council actually praised Libya. And I'm wondering if you would be able to give some background into why that is, because it seems, I don't know, it just seems a little contradictory for them to do that only a year before we launched the invasion to oust Qadhafi.
I do not recall seeing that. I don't remember them praising. I mean, I think I don't remember. I mean, when I was there, it was still a very brutal place. There was this hope that he might be reforming under his son, Saif al-Islam, but by late 2010, that process had all but, died out. There was a very prominent human rights activist who was still in prison that was the object of a lot of American attention. So I don't recall that report.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Glad to see you again.
Hey, how are you? Hi.
Very good. A quick question regarding Mr. Khalifa Haftar.
Yes.
How could a third-rate henchman of Muammar Gaddafi live in Northern Virginia for several years as a poor man, literally, I mean, the scale of not even middle class, after several years, at the age of 72, manage to go back with weapons and money? Could you explain that?
It's one of the great, I would read my book, it's all in there. So he's one of the great characters of this book, this story of this exile who, as you mentioned, was, fled Chad, resided in, and then comes back in 2011 when the revolution starts, hoping to play a role and gets shunted aside. How did he do it? Well, it's in the book. I mean, he was very skillful, and so he did, and I think, well, to give away a little answer, I think he had Arab backers. He had Egyptians and Emiratis helping him too, and when Libyans I speak to say they're aware of those faults, but he was the man of the hour. He was, he stepped into a void. He was promising something at that time.
I believe you said that we do still have an embassy in Libya.
Sorry, no, it was evacuated.
It was evacuated.
Yeah, it's in Tunis. It's a very small presence in Tunis. There's no ambassador right now either. So.
I just wondered, regarding other countries, do they have diplomatic representation there? Are there full embassies from some countries that are there?
Yes, the Italians are there. They have a long history with Libya. They were one of the first to return to Libya after the civil war. So they're there. I think there are some other countries that are have a presence or a rotating presence. They're sending their diplomats back in for days at a time, and they're coming. The UN is back there. So, Tripoli is getting safe for a bit. So, yeah. My pleasure.